At dawn, the castle gate opened, and a small procession crossed the frost-stiff drawbridge. No trumpets, no drums, only the creak of leather and a child's thin breath fogging in the cold. A nobleman's son, clean tunic, bound wrists, was led into the great hall beneath carved saints and iron candelabra, past a king who did not look at him, only at the father who had knelt and failed. A parchment lay on the table. A seal waited. The body of the child was the pen. In the middle, ages, treaties were written in flesh before they were written in ink. When a lord rebelled, when a prince broke faith, when a border shivered with doubt, kings demanded what could not run, the bodies of their enemies' children. Some were kept as honorable wards, raised at court in velvet and suspicion. Others were veiled in cloisters, their hair shorn so they could never inherit, and when oaths shattered, there were punishments meant to be remembered. A blinding in a torchlit chamber, a scaffold erected at noon, a row of small figures in silent chains. This is a story told behind banners and within chapels, where mercy wore a crown and cruelty kept the keys. It is not a parade of gore. It is a study of power, intimate, legal, and deliberate. Because in the medieval world, a child could be a hostage, a sacrament, a weapon, and a warning, all before he could lift a sword. If you crave history that doesn't flinch, the kind that turns the velvet of royal halls inside out, subscribe. Tonight, we will walk the corridor where diplomacy ended and dread began. And we will ask why so many kings trusted a promise only when it breathed. It begins, always, with silence. In the great hall, where banners hung heavy with dust and incense, the lord who had rebelled knelt before his king. The air was thick with the smell of wax and steel, the murmurs of courtiers, the scrape of a quill preparing to write history. Around them, torches sputtered in iron sconces, their flames bending toward the draft that crept through the cracks of stone. And beside the kneeling man stood his son, no older than 12. He did not cry. His tunic was spotless, his hair combed, by trembling hands that morning. He did not yet understand that this ceremony, so solemn and quiet, was a sentencing disguised as mercy. The herald read aloud the oath, that the Lord would swear eternal loyalty to the crown, pay his tribute in coin and blood, and, most important, deliver his child as surety of that promise. To medieval kings, words were dust. Blood was binding. In that age, trust could not survive without collateral. To seal a treaty or guarantee obedience, rulers demanded what could not flee, the bodies of their enemies' children. It was not called cruelty. It was law. The child was a hostage, from the old Norman hostage meaning guest. A guest who would never be allowed to leave. The ritual was rehearsed across centuries. The father would place his hand on the gospel, kiss the king's signet, and say the words that sealed his lineage. I give you my son in pledge of my faith. Then the boy was led away, sometimes to the king's court, sometimes to a distant castle under guard, sometimes to a monastery for safekeeping. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was a kind of death. To the court chroniclers, it was diplomacy. To the parents, it was torment. In Angevin, England, King Henry II perfected the art. When the Welsh princes defied him, he demanded their heirs as guests. The boys were brought to London, dressed in fine clothes, taught Latin, manners, and obedience. They dined in gilded halls beside noble sons, prisoners disguised as courtiers. When their fathers rebelled again, the charade ended. Chroniclers wrote of the hostages hanged for their sire's perjury, of children blinded by royal order, so no sword might rest in their hand. Henry's grandson, King John, inherited the same cold logic. The rebellion of the Welsh continued, and again children were seized. In 1212, after one such uprising, He ordered that the sons of rebel lords be taken from their beds and hung before their fathers' eyes from the walls of Nottingham and Bristol. It was not rage. It was policy. Terror was more durable than pity. But not every hostage died. Many grew up within royal courts, half pampered, half watched. Some became loyal, molded by flattery and fear. The sons of Scottish and Irish nobles spent years in English castles, taught the language of their conquerors, made to believe that submission was sophistication. When they returned home as men, they were not warriors anymore. They were courtiers, the king's echo in another tongue. That was the true genius of the system. The hostage was not merely insurance. He was education by captivity. The line between prisoner and protege blurred. A child could dine beside a prince and still be a bargaining chip, a living message between two towers. Kings understood the power of affection. If a rebel's son learned to love his captor, rebellion became harder to imagine. But there were others, the unlucky, the expendable, who vanished into the dark architecture of castles. In cold northern keeps, they were lodged under guard, given tutors, scribes, and just enough hope to keep them docile. Chroniclers rarely recorded their names. They appear in margins. The boy was sent to Winchester. The youth was kept at Tea. Corfe. The lord's daughter was veiled at Fontevraud. Behind each short line lay years of silence. To medieval rulers it was divine order. Kings ruled by the grace of God, and rebellion against them was heresy. To punish a rebel's child was to remind the world that God's will passed through royal veins. No act could be too harsh when it preserved that order. And so the phrase "pledge of flesh" became a grim proverb. It was understood across languages and continents, from the Norman courts of France to the Byzantine palaces of Constantinople. The body of a child was the safest lock a king could forge. No parchment was more binding than fear. At night, those children dreamed of home, of mothers who might never see them again, of fathers who might die before they could be redeemed. Some prayed, some forgot. A few learned to smile when the king entered, for survival was the only crown they would ever wear. And sometimes, when the oaths broke and armies marched again, their lives were forfeit before the first sword was drawn. The body of the child was the first casualty of treason, and often the last word of peace. If the first tool of power was chains, the second was silence. In the medieval world, death was not always the preferred punishment for a rival's child. Death was visible, bloody, finite, and in its finality lay danger. A corpse could be mourned, turned into a symbol, a martyr, a spark for rebellion. A living heir, neutralized without death, was safer. And so kings learned another craft, not the art of killing, but the art of erasure. There were many ways to make a child vanish, without a blade. One was the tonsure, the thin circular shaving of the crown of the head, the mark of a monk. To the church, it was a gesture of humility, a renunciation of worldly power. But in the hands of kings, it was a political amputation. The moment a child's head was shorn, his right to inherit a throne was gone. It happened behind cloister doors, without trumpets or witnesses. Picture it, a boy of 10, dressed in linen, led by a priest into a chapel lit by trembling candles. The walls smell of incense and wet stone. His hair, the last symbol of his lineage, is cut away, the golden strands falling to the floor like autumn leaves. He is told this is holy service. In truth, it is exile. When the ritual ends, he is not a prince anymore. He is a monk. His name changes. His garments darken. His letters home are censored or burned. To the law, he no longer exists. This was how Byzantine emperors neutralized rivals. To blind or to tonsure a claimant was called showing mercy. For to kill a noble child was to risk sin, but to make him unfit for rule, that was divine prudence. One chronicler tells of Constantine VI blinded by his own mother, Empress Irene, so that no one might call him emperor again. His eyes, once symbols of divine right, became proof of its revocation. The act was performed not in the dungeon, but in the palace chapel, a holy theater where mutilation became ritual. In Western Europe, the practice took subtler forms. The church provided both refuge and prison. When a rival noble's daughter was veiled as a nun, it was called protection. In truth, it was confinement in God's name. The veil, once a symbol of purity, became a royal sentence. Once placed upon the head, it was irrevocable. The girl who wore it became property of the convent, her inheritance extinguished, her womb rendered politically sterile. She could not marry, bear heirs, or forge alliances. She was, in every sense, removed from the game. These holy prisons dotted the map of Europe, quiet stone walls filled with voices that had once been royal. At Fontevraud, in France, the abbess kept veiled daughters of rival houses. In England, the convent at Amesbury received those the crown wished forgotten. Some nuns had once been princesses, others were never told why they had been chosen. Their letters, when they survived, speak not of hatred, but of confusion. "I pray for my father's health," wrote one, "though I do not know if he still lives." In Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the practice evolved further. Blinding or castration of potential heirs became almost bureaucratic, sanctioned by both crown and church. Chroniclers recorded it without outrage, as though it were as natural as the changing of the seasons. Thus was peace maintained, one monk wrote, "For no man may rebel for a son who cannot see or sire." Mercy, in those centuries, wore a strange mask. Even in England, where the crown preferred the cloak of legality, the same thinking ruled. When King Henry I feared rival claims from the children of his barons, he sent several to monasteries for education. Most never left. The charters recording their donations to God are written in elegant Latin, the language of eternity, the language of disappearance. Behind each line lies a silent tomb that was not a grave. To the outside world, these acts appeared righteous. The king preserved peace. The church gained a soul. The parents, if still alive, were assured their child lived in holiness, but beneath the gilded rhetoric of salvation was an understanding too cruel to voice. This was the cleanest way to kill without killing. Imagine the silence after the gates closed, the sound of footsteps fading down a corridor, the echo of iron bolts sliding home. The child inside, stripped of name, of title, of purpose, was expected to pray for the ruler who had stolen his life. Some did. Some refused. A few decades later were rediscovered, gray-haired monks who still remembered the feel of a crown they had never worn. Not all were so fortunate. In the East, mutilation remained the safeguard of empire. To blind was to erase divine legitimacy. To castrate was to extinguish dynastic threat. The Byzantines recorded it in cold ink. The boy was rendered unfit to reign. To them, it was cleaner than blood. And so across centuries, across continents, the pattern held. Where the sword ended, the veil began. Kings understood that terror did not always require a scream. Sometimes it only required silence, the slow suffocation of a life repurposed. In the next chapter, when oaths finally broke and rebellion returned, the masks of mercy fell away. Then, even the language of God could not hide the smell of burning, wood or the sound of chains, because when promises failed, kings remembered their hostages, and mercy turned to spectacle. The court's silence always comes first, that moment before a messenger kneels, breathless, and the hall turns to stone. "My lord," he gasps, "they have risen. Rebellion." Every king knows the word by heart, and every rebel knows what follows. It begins not with armies, but with lists, the names of those who have betrayed, and the children they left behind as pledges of their faith. The clerks write carefully. The ink must not smudge when it records the price of treason. When oaths broke, mercy became treason. The practice had rules, written nowhere but followed everywhere. A rebel could be forgiven if he bent the knee before the throne, but if his banners stayed aloft, the fate of his hostages was no longer in God's hands. It was in the kings, and kings, especially those made cruel by insecurity, knew the power of theater. In England, King John understood this more than most. The year was 1212. The Welsh lords had sworn allegiance, sent their sons as hostages, and then, one by one, rose against him. The rebellion was small, distant, and easily crushed, but John's pride was larger than his kingdom. To him, broken faith was personal, so he gathered the hostages. Boys, some barely able to ride. They were brought in wagons to Nottingham and Bristol, guarded by men who avoided looking at them. Chroniclers wrote that John ordered their deaths, without pity or pause. Others claimed the boys were hanged before their father's walls, the wind tugging at their small limbs like broken banners. No priest recorded their last prayers. No burial was granted. Their names are lost. Only their father's fear remains in the pages of history. The message was clear. Oaths are written in blood, and when one spills, the rest must follow. It was not madness. It was math. The medieval world was held together by fragile lines of loyalty. Without written law, fear was the only contract that worked. Kings had to show the cost of betrayal, not just to punish, but to instruct. In France, the Capetian kings refined the spectacle. Captured hostages were paraded before the court, dressed in mourning black. Chroniclers speak of one such event. In the 13th century, a rebellious count was forced to kneel as his son was led past him, a hood over his head. "You have made him a bastard," the king said quietly. The crowd applauded, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. The message echoed across Europe. In Scotland, Edward I of England, the hammer of the Scots, took the sons of rebellious nobles and sent them south as wards of the crown. When the uprisings continued, their rations were cut, their tutors dismissed, their cells locked. Some were never seen again. "It is better," one chronicler wrote, "to starve one boy than to lose one kingdom." To rule, a king had to become his own executioner. But not all vengeance was loud. Some punishments were whispered. A child might vanish from the record, his name struck from charters. A daughter might be married to a minor knight in a far province, her bloodline diluted until no one remembered its claim. Death was not the only end. Obscurity could be worse. Still, there were moments when even the chroniclers flinched. In Germany, during the reign of Emperor Frederick II, a group of Sicilian rebels surrendered on the promise their children would be spared. Weeks later, when word came that the rebellion smoldered again, Frederick ordered the hostages brought to the palace square. Their fathers watched as soldiers drew blades, not to strike, but to brand. The imperial eagle was burned into their foreheads. They would live, he said, but live marked. A kingdom cannot trust mercy. Even so, there were kings who hesitated. Chronicles tell of Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, who refused to execute hostages even after betrayal. "Let justice end with me," he told his advisors. "If I kill their sons, I kill their repentance." It was a rare spark of humanity in an age built on spectacle. But even his mercy could not erase the precedent others had written in bone. Ennui. Castles and towns, the lesson was carved into memory. Never rebel when your blood is held by the king. Mothers learned it too. There are accounts of women smuggling their children away in peasant carts before their husbands swore oaths, fearing the day they might be requested for royal custody. One letter from a Breton noblewoman survives, her handwriting frantic. "If they ask for my son, tell them he is dead, even if God takes offense." The power of hostage-taking was not simply the threat of execution, it was the dread of choice. Every father who rose against the crown knew he was gambling with his lineage. Every mother who watched her child ride away knew rebellion might end, in an empty cradle. And yet, rebellion never stopped. Because there is something in human pride that refuses to learn from terror. When the next uprising flared, in Wales, in Saxony, in Burgundy, the same rituals began again. The parchment, the oaths, the tears, the promises that no one truly believed. And when those promises broke, the bodies of children became the punctuation marks of history. They were the commas between wars, the periods after surrender, the silences between one king's cruelty and the next. If the pen is mightier than the sword, the kings of the Middle Ages used both, and made the bodies of the innocent the ink between them. By the 13th century, hostage-taking had stopped being a scandal. It had become infrastructure. The kings of medieval Europe had learned to turn fear into policy. What began as vengeance had become administration, a bureaucratic machine of threats, wards, and royal custody. It was no longer the whim of a cruel monarch. It was written into charters, marriage contracts, and the DNA of every feudal bond. The system was simple, brilliant, and terrible. Every rebellion, every alliance, every treaty required collateral. A noble's child became that collateral. A duke's son was sent to serve as a page in the king's household. A rival's daughter became the bride of a loyal vassal. If loyalty could not be trusted, it was purchased with bloodlines. And so castles became cages wrapped in velvet. At Windsor, Rouen, and Poitiers, young heirs of rival houses grew up inside royal courts, learning the very etiquette of their captors. They were taught Latin, the Psalms, and the art of war, under the watchful eye of guards who never forgot the purpose of their education. The crown paid their tutors, fed them richly, dressed them in silks. It was not kindness, it was conditioning. This system had a name, wardship. To be a ward of the king was an honor in public, a humiliation in private. It meant your estate, and your future, belonged to someone else. When the king held your body, he also held your inheritance. When you came of age, your marriage, your fortune, and your loyalty were all his to command. A child who entered the royal household as a hostage might leave as a servant, or as a husband to someone chosen by the crown. In this way, feudal, monarchs rewove their kingdoms one generation at a time, replacing defiance with dependency. It was not only England. In France, Philip IV perfected the model. His court glittered with young hostages, the sons of Gascon lords, the nephews of Flemish counts, even distant kin of rebellious bishops. He entertained them with tournaments and feasts, but every smile was a leash. Chroniclers wrote that, when one Gascon lord dared rebel again, Philip summoned his son and fed him at the king's table for a week before sending him home in a coffin. In Byzantium, the same logic had long been refined into ritual. Rival princes were brought to Constantinople to be educated under imperial tutors. They were dressed in purple silk, taught court Greek, and paraded at festivals, a living declaration of the emperor's reach. When they tried to escape, the punishment was not death, but blinding, a mark of disgrace that ensured the empire's mercy looked divine. Fear was never random, it was designed. Every link in the feudal chain depended on it. Lords feared their kings, peasants feared their lords. The church preached that obedience was holy, that rebellion was the language of damnation, and when faith was not enough, memory was. Everyone had heard the stories, the boys of Nottingham, the blind princes of Byzantium, the little hostages who vanished into abbeys. In a world where written law was rare, stories were stronger than decrees. The machinery of fear needed no gears, no smoke, no iron. It lived in the imagination. It whispered, "If you betray the king, your sons will hang where your banners flew." Even the process of ransom, that seemingly humane exchange of captives, became part of this machine. After every battle, royal clerks descended upon the fields to record the names of captured noble youths. Lists were drawn, coins were counted, and futures were priced like livestock. The greater your name, the higher your cost. It was an economy of pain that stretched across nations. In France, during the 100 Years' War, the capture of a noble youth could fund an entire campaign. A baron's ransom might pay for a year of siege. Sometimes kings released hostages, not out of mercy, but out of profit, buying one more season of war. And so, across Europe, captivity became currency. Even the church played its part. Monasteries profited from donations made to house noble wards, pretending piety while ensuring their guests could never leave. Priests preached sermons on the virtue of obedience while blessing the treaties that demanded human collateral. In their ledgers, hostages were recorded as pledges to divine order. The machine had no heart, only momentum. For the kings who ruled it, fear was a form of governance, efficient, measurable, and deeply human. They understood that nothing binds the soul faster than dread for one's children. No edict could command loyalty like the threat of loss. And yet, this very system that held kingdoms together also began to hollow them from within. And the wards, raised in royal courts, learned submission too well. When they inherited their estates, they ruled as shadows of the men who once defied the crown. The great families of Europe softened, their pride replaced by calculation, their loyalty bought not by love, but by survival. That was the machine's paradox. The more it succeeded, the weaker it made the world it ruled. By the late Middle Ages, the memory of mass hostage executions faded, not from mercy, but from refinement. The spectacle of blood gave way to paperwork, marriage contracts, and clerical seals. Kings no longer needed to hang children from walls. They could erase them with ink. And still, the fear remained. Every noble child who rode to court as a guest knew the truth. The velvet cushion could at any moment become a noose. Fear had become polite. It wore rings and robes, spoke Latin, and prayed before supper. But it was still fear, the most efficient instrument of monarchy ever forged. And like all instruments of power, it played until the world changed its tune. Because in time, the torchlight of palaces would fade, and the world would begin to call these acts not governance, but crime. The age of kings would fall. But the machinery of fear, rebranded, refined, would find new forms. When the age of castles dimmed and the fires of the Middle Ages sank into ash, Europe tried to forget what it had been. But the ghosts of those children, the sons and daughters given in pledge, the hostages raised beneath banners not their own, refused to vanish. They lingered in chronicles, in songs, in the language of treaties. The ink that once bound kingdoms still carried traces of their blood. By the dawn of the Renaissance, hostage-taking had begun to lose its sacred disguise. The scholars and jurists of a new age, those who wrote of humanism and divine reason, started to see what their ancestors had not, that fear had been codified, that the politics of mercy had long been an illusion. But even as Europe claimed enlightenment, the practice survived in subtler forms. When Henry VIII demanded, "The sons of Irish chieftains be raised in London as wards," the tradition of captive loyalty was simply reborn in courtly language. When Francis Thoupt of France traded his own sons to the Spanish Emperor Charles V as the price of his release after the Battle of Pavia, the old ritual of flesh for peace returned, not as barbarism, but as diplomacy. The princes were kept in the fortress of Madrid for 4 long years, educated and humiliated under imperial watch. They were treated well. They were fed, clothed, entertained, but they were still collateral, living signatures beneath a broken treaty. Even kings themselves, it seemed, were not above the system they had built. And as Europe marched toward the modern age, hostage-taking began to outgrow the palace and enter the battlefield. The Crusades had already given birth to ransom as an institution, a currency, of noble lives traded for coin. But in later centuries, it evolved again, from feudal custom to statecraft. By the 17th century, as diplomacy replaced conquest and ink replaced fire, the idea of the hostage changed shape. No longer a child sent to a rival court, but a word, a term, used to describe the same old exchange of flesh for trust. The modern state simply learned to hide its cruelty beneath parchment. And yet, the memory of the old ways remained, alive in legend, twisted in folklore. Stories spread of princes locked in towers who vanished without trace, of lost heirs raised among their enemies, of ghostly children who haunted the corridors of ruined castles. Chroniclers romanticized what their ancestors had feared. The murdered or vanished heir became a motif. The princes in the tower, the lost dauphin, the blinded heirs of Byzantium. The world no longer burned its enemies' children in public squares, but it kept telling stories about those who did. Because in those stories, people recognized something enduring. The uneasy truth that power, even dressed in gold, is never gentle. And so, by the time Europe began to draft its first codes of international law, the moral stain was already centuries old. The idea that the innocent must not be punished for the guilty, that children are sacred even in war, was not born from enlightenment. It was born from exhaustion, from the horror of remembering what kings once did. When the Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, its architects claimed a new order had begun, one based on sovereignty, negotiation, and peace. But even then, in its clauses and subclauses, hostage exchanges still lingered as legal instruments. It would take another 200 years before nations would dare to call them crimes. In the 19th century, as empires fell and republics rose, the ghosts of those medieval hostages became symbols of innocence betrayed. Painters and poets revived them, pale children beneath cold arches, mothers weeping behind barred doors. They were no longer forgotten names in royal ledgers. They had become mirrors for conscience. It was only after the unspeakable violence of the 20th century, after the wars that turned cities into graves and children into refugees, that the world finally wrote the words that should have existed all along. In 1949, the Geneva Conventions declared hostage-taking a crime under international law. 1,000 years of terror distilled into one sentence. No person shall be taken hostage. A simple line. Too late for all who came before. And yet, the irony persists, because even now, in an age of paper and pixels, the logic of the medieval king survives. Nations still trade the innocent for power. Armies still hold civilians as leverage. Families still whisper prayers for the safe return of those used as bargaining chips in other men's games. The words have changed. Detention, security, collateral. But the machinery of fear hums quietly beneath it all, familiar as the tolling of an old bell. The only difference is that today, we call it politics. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of those lost children, that their suffering forced humanity to define mercy, even if only in writing. Every law that forbids hostage-taking is written upon their silence. Every treaty that protects the innocent stands upon the bones of the forgotten. So when we walk through ruined keeps and see the faded crests above old gates, when we read the chronicles of kings who promised peace in exchange for sons and daughters, we should remember what those walls once heard. Not the shouts of battle, but the smaller sounds. A father's breath breaking as he signs away his heir. A door closing. The click of a lock. The faint sound of a child's footsteps fading down a stone corridor toward a future that would not remember his name. That is the sound of history learning what mercy costs. And the echo of that sound. The hush after the oath. The silence. After the door is what finally taught the world to write its first laws of peace. Because before there was justice, there was only the pledge of flesh.